We're talking about nationalism and its connection to archaeology. And we left off looking at Iran and looking at how the Shah of Iran in the 50s, 60s, and 70s used the past of the Persian Empire for essentially propaganda, ideological purposes. The same could be said about not just the use of archaeology, but the destruction of archaeology, the intentional destruction of archaeology, and really the most, most recent and most well-known example of this would be ISIS targeting ancient remains, where you could say they did this for several reasons. It was part of a campaign of ethnic cleansing. You destroy the history of the people in order to eventually destroy the people themselves. It was to destroy their connection of those people to the land. You're creating a people without history by destroying the history. They also used it as a propaganda tool because they know Westerners outside of Syria and Iraq thought that archaeology was important, and this was a way for ISIS to sort of rub the noses of Westerners in the destruction. And this, wasn't something that only ISIS was doing. Obviously, the Taliban was doing this way back in 2001 when they destroyed the Buddha statues at Bamyan, just a few weeks before the attacks on 9/11. So we've seen intentional destruction by ISIS at Palmyra. We also saw that Assyrian cities like Nimrud, and they broadcast this and made videos, and they use this as a propaganda tool. These, you can see the before and after picture here of the Buddhas at Bamyan. These were some of the largest Buddha statues in the world, and again, it was a way for the Taliban to erase the history before Islam. We talked a little bit about Iraq, right, and how Saddam Hussein used Mesopotamian past for propaganda purposes. So here we can see Hammurabi and Saddam Hussein and the Code of Hammurabi over here, and the walls of Babylon. And again, Saddam Hussein trying to link himself to the past and use this as a way of creating a Iraqi identity and creating a sense of unity. And I guess less harmful examples, but still kind of ideological uses of archaeology. You can see here, this is the lintel on the entrance to the Oriental Institute Museum at the University of Chicago. And it's a museum that's dedicated to archaeology of the Middle East. And you can see kind of a little bit of propaganda going on here. We have an Egyptian standing here and an American, quote unquote, standing over here. Symbols of Egypt, like the lion, symbol of America, the bison. You've got a crusader, a archaeologist, I guess some scientists and Greeks over here. Oops. Let's go back. And then you have Hammurabi, Assyrian kings, Persian kings over here. So essentially, it's kind of showing, the ancient civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, giving, I guess, the gifts of civilization to America, right? And here, I guess I think this might be the University of Chicago Tower. I'm not sure. This is like Notre Dame Cathedral. So trying to show that link, where a link really there's not obviously a very direct link that they're portraying. So ideology and archaeology are very connected outside the United States. Less so here, like you've sort of seen. Native American archaeology is not really seen in the same way as the archaeology of, let's say, ancient Greece to the modern Greeks. So a lot of this misuse or overuse of archaeology is connected to state building and nationalism, trying to create a sense of shared identity, trying to create a sense of who the people are. This is especially important if you have many different people from diverse backgrounds. So Iraq, for example, under Saddam Hussein, you had Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, Sunni Kurds, these different ethnic and religious groups. How could they actually be united into one nation? Well, maybe a sort of sense of Iraqi-ness that goes back to ancient Mesopotamia. So that's sort of how they sometimes use it. But of course, there's the sort of the objectification of the other, you could say, or the distortion of the other. So, movies like 300, but also you can go back a little bit before that. The sort of exotization of the East, the exotization of the East, and presenting the Persians obviously in a very inaccurate light, and making the Greek wars against the Persians sort of a model for contemporary East-West conflict, when in actuality the wars between Greece and Persia are not the same as the conflict between Europe and the Middle East that we see today, right? Culturally and economically, classical Greece was strongly connected to the Persian Empire. You could probably say that the ancient Greeks and the ancient Persians had more in common with each other than the ancient Greeks and other Europeans to the north, which the Greeks considered to be barbarian tribes. Right? So this, obviously, we've seen depictions of Persian kings. This is not what a Persian king looked like. Okay, so a lot of this is also related to our ideas of Western culture. And when the idea of Western culture first appears. So it's obviously not a direct link between classical Greece and Rome and Europe as we see it today. There's a big controversy involving Macedonia, which is a province in northern Greece, and the Republic of Macedonia, which is a Slavic nation that incorporates a portion of ancient Macedonia, but mainly territory to the north, in terms of, and the controversy surrounds the use of the name and the connection to ancient Macedonian culture. So, to the Greeks, Alexander the Great was Greek. The ancient state of Macedon was a Greek state, right? And so you can see with the Oliver Stone film, right? The Macedonians, they're talking about the Slavic nation here. I want to inform you that we reject the movie as historically inaccurate, for it is not a true story of Alexander Stone claims it to be. We're particularly concerned by the Greekness that Stone has given the Macedonian king. So Macedonians here, right, lay claim in some ways to the ancient history of Alexander the Great. Greeks get very, very upset by this, and they say that ancient Greek culture is being co-opted by a country that doesn't have really a historical connection to this figure or to this time period. But after this nation was created, this new nation of Slavic speakers had to create an identity, had to create a name, had to create symbols, and it used archaeology for that. So it took the ancient Macedonian symbol that was on the shields of Alexander's army and used it for their flag. Right here you can see this rally for Greek Macedonia, no recognition of the Scopian Republic under the Hellenic name Macedonia, no Macedonia for Slavs. Right? So to an outsider, you might think, oh well, why are they fighting over this? It's it's nothing. It's just a quibble, right? But to the people involved, it's very, very important because it has to do with identity. Here you can see in the capital of the Slavic Republic of Macedonia, sometimes now it's called the Macedonian Republic or the Republic of Macedon, to differentiate it between Macedonia and Greece. In Skopje, in the capital, right? So here you can see the statue of Alexander the Great. So to the Greeks, the Macedonians are co-opting their culture. That's what they think is going on here. You see the same thing, well, not the same thing, but you see kind of a similar process working out in Turkey with the creation of a secular republic. So with the Ottoman Empire, religion was a very unifying aspect, even though there were Christians and Jews living in the Ottoman Empire. They had essentially Christians and Jews were considered to be separate nations within the Ottoman Empire. Then when Ataturk came to power in the 1920s, he created a secular republic. And when you're creating a secular republic and you can't rely on Islam for the purposes of identity and creating a new nation, you rely on archaeology or ancient history, and that's exactly what Ataturk did. And in some cases stretched the facts to fit the ideology. So for one thing, the Hittites became Proto-Turks. The Hittites spoke an Indo-European language. The Turkish language descends from Central Asia. Right? Turks came from Central Asia and conquered that region and conquered the Byzantine Empire. Are the ancestors of the Turks today the Hittites? Yeah, in many respects they probably are. Culturally and linguistically, though, not so much. So to claim the Hittites as kind of proto-Turks or the beginnings of Turkishness is not really accurate. But they went back even before the Hittites. So the early Bronze Age bronze artifacts you can see that were excavated at a site called Alacahuyuk became important symbols for the Turkish Republic, right? So here's the actual object. The actual object is about 6 inches, maybe a foot high, and this one is a massive replica. Again, it's supposed to sort of give symbols for a new nation. Ataturk also claimed that the Turkish nation has origins in ancient Mesopotamia, even though Turkey's really on the northern fringe of Mesopotamia. Iraq really is ancient Mesopotamia. But you could see this textile store was called Sumer Bank, right? So after the Sumerians. Obviously with Israel and Palestine, the archaeology is very contentious. Not only are you talking about the Bible and religion, but you're also talking about, this hot button political issue that's been going on since really before 1948 and has not been resolved, and which people who are not Israeli or Palestinian get very heated over. Now, you could sort of understand when Israel was formed in the beginning, archaeology played a very, very important role in the formation of Israel. It was a way to connect Jews, or to show a connection, or to prove a connection, or to demonstrate a connection of Jews to the ancient land. It was a way of sort of reconstructing the ancient history of Jews in the area. And you could see how those people, those archaeologists, would be focused on the biblical archaeology, the archaeology of biblical times, and they might pay less attention to the time period before and the time period after, even though that's not the way archaeology should work. Um, Also, we can see when you compare the views of secular versus religious Jews, it's similar to what we've seen in other countries too, where the more secular you are, the more the ancient history and the archaeology has a role to play in the ideology. And so this is a very, very controversial topic when you're talking about, is there archaeological evidence for an ancient Israel? How accurate is the Bible? Et cetera, et cetera. And there really are two extremes. And just as you'd expect, the truth lies in between. But the school of what we call biblical minimalism says that, and we talked a little bit about this before when we talked about biblical archaeology, that the Old Testament is a very late development, and they even go so far as to say that there really wasn't a kingdom of ancient Israel. They say King David and Solomon were completely mythological people. They didn't actually exist in real life. And so they would say, well, there's really no archaeology that connects Jews to Israel. And this is politically motivated in many respects. If you can, since a lot of Israelis were using archaeology to bolster the argument that Israel is where there should be a Jewish state, if you could undermine that argument, you undermine the foundation of the state itself, or you try to do that. That's really a lot of the motivation behind biblical minimalism, even though a lot of people would deny that. The minimalists would deny that. They'd say, no, there's no political motivation whatsoever. Biblical maximalism also has a political motivation on the other side, right? That is, they say every word of the Bible's true, and they very much are promoting an idea that the Bible and archaeology prove that there was a Jewish homeland in history, and strengthens this argument of the existence or the argument grounding a Jewish state there today. The middle ground, I would say, a good example of that would be this archaeologist Israel Finkelstein, who really just looks at the archaeology and examines what it says. And what he has found with a lot of his evidence is there are certain figures in the Bible, like King David and King Solomon, who did exist, but their achievements are probably exaggerated, and that Israel doesn't become a powerful kingdom until much later, and that there is obviously an existence of an ancient kingdom of Israel and Judah in that territory, but it probably comes from an earlier Canaanite tradition, and so a lot of people who think the way he does, where you have to separate the Bible from the archaeology, you have to think critically about it, would say that you shouldn't really use archaeology for this kind of ideology to begin with. It really should be an objective science if you can make it that way. But the historic sites in Israel have always had a strong role to play in nationalism and ideology. So here we see the Israeli Defense Forces on the top of Masada, which is an important archaeological site in Israel, taking their oath to be initiated into the army. Masada was Herod's, the area where Herod actually had a palace. And during a revolt against, so here you can see the Dead Sea over here. It's a really amazing site. But after King Herod died, these Jewish zealots who were resisting Rome, and the people that were resisting Rome by the end were the kind of the most zealous of them. They basically had to retreat. They were losing to the Romans. They had to retreat to Masada. The Romans besieged the entire site and built a huge ramp to get up to the walls. And the story is that the Jews inside Masada committed suicide rather than surrender to the Romans. So it became kind of this symbol of resistance and the famous last stand in history. And one of the important Israeli archaeologists, who was also a general, his name was Yigal Yadin, he excavated at Masada. So Masada has become a very important symbol. But some people think that the event, this mass suicide, didn't happen the way it's portrayed. There may not have been a mass suicide, so it may not have been this place of last resistance. Plus, the people who made this last stand were today we would call them extremists. They were not the moderates who were resisting Roman rule. They were the ones who were the most extreme. So they don't really correspond to, you'd say, maybe the modern Israeli. Yigal Yadin, once when they were having an oath of allegiance of the Israeli Defense Forces, said, when Napoleon stood among his troops next to the pyramids of Egypt, he declared that 4,000 years of history looked down upon you. But what would he not have given to be able to say to his men, 4,000 years of your own history look down upon you? The echo of your oath on this night will resound throughout the encampments of our foes. Its significance is not less powerful than all our armaments, right? So you could really see the importance there of historical places, archaeology, history in modern ideology. Right, when the president of Israel, Zalman Shalzar, right, visited the site, Yadin said Masada was the symbol of our refusal to live as slaves. And sometimes people have said Masada shall not fall again as sort of a battle cry of resistance, the way Remember the Alamo is sometimes, was used obviously during the war against Mexico. So there's a lot of people who have stakes in the archaeology of Israel and Palestine. Some people fund research, and there's work going on in what's now called the City of David, outside of the old city of Jerusalem, ancient remains that go back to the Canaanites. And some people, worry that the funding by, let's say, evangelical Christians will influence the way the archaeology is interpreted, right? That is, the people here who are funding it obviously want to see something from their investment. Does that mean that you're going to interpret things in a certain way to make it seem like King David was more powerful than he was? Or are you going to say, the evidence dates to the time period of King David, but we can't tie it to King David? So this is problematic. And it also gets into conflicts with territory, ownership of land, and this, attempts to have a modern two-state solution or a modern peace deal between Israelis and Palestinians. And so there's a lot of, unfortunately, you could say missteps on both sides. And there's also deliberate destruction sometimes. So the Palestinian Authority, which runs the Temple Mount, they control that area. And sometimes they do renovations, according to the Israelis, without regard to the archaeology. And so a new project started up where Israeli archaeologists were going through the debris of these renovations in order to find artifacts that were thrown out as a result of this work, in order to salvage any history that might have been essentially thrown out of the Temple Mount. And they found a number of things. They found arrowheads, seals, dating from many different time periods. The archaeological context is destroyed, but they know it comes from the Temple Mount. So this is kind of a problem. If one side is working on a project and they're not paying attention to the archaeology, it could have real damage, unfortunately. There's also problems with just out denial. So, for extremist Israeli Jews, you would say, oh, the Palestinians have no connection to the land, they're modern Arabs, which is not true. They do have a connection to the land. But that would be the extremist view on the Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, they might say, oh, going with the biblical minimalist view, there never was a temple here, there never was a King Solomon, so Palestinian Authority officials and Arafat during the 90s when Clinton was trying to broker a peace deal, said things like, we found Islamic remains, Roman remains, nothing Jewish. That's not true. They found seals in the old city. They found other evidence that shows that there was an ancient Israelite, ancient Judean presence in the city. So denialism on both sides is not really a good idea. And then there's intentional destruction. And unfortunately, Hamas is a religious group, so they're less interested in archaeology. But a lot of Palestinians are interested and want to know about ancient Canaanite remains because they consider them ancestral in a sense. Then there's controversy regarding archaeology that's being done in East Jerusalem. Some Palestinians believe that not only are archaeologists trying to identify areas and say that they are part of ancient Jerusalem when during the time of the Bible, but they're also using it as an excuse to evict Palestinians from their homes and take that territory, take that their land, and under the guise of archaeology. So there's just so many layers to this issue, political, religious. It's just hard to unwrap it all. And so what do you do in this situation? If you believe that archaeology is important, is there a middle ground? It's very, very difficult. Also, if you believe in a strict interpretation of the Bible, you believe that the Israelites came in and conquered the land. The archaeology is now showing us more and more that the ancient Israelites were an outgrowth of the Canaanites who were living in that territory to begin with. Right? Obviously, there are academics who just want to do research, and there is a middle ground, and that's really the majority of the archaeologists who consider archaeology to be a scientific discipline. A lot of people are not professional archaeologists who tend to distort it and distort the evidence.